Oh man, do we have a good one for you today. Welcome back to A Year of Final Fantasy, and we're going to be talking about something a little bit more meta. Alright, stick with me. We're going to take a look at the battle systems of the Final Fantasy games. That's right, all of them, all 15 games. I wanted to talk about this during the Final Fantasy VIII month because Final Fantasy VIII really strayed away from the conventional battle system with a pretty interesting take on it as we look under the hood. So we're going to be looking at the major games of the franchise, and if we were going to do all of the games just in general, no. I enjoy my sanity way too much. So we're just going to stick with the main 15, and believe me, this is going to be a pretty long episode anyway. So with this, I attempt to touch on the battle system in each of the major games. We are going to be talking about 8, 9, 10, 11, all the way through 15, and we haven't got there yet, but I'm going to go ahead and just succinctly talk about the original games that we've already talked about, and we'll just go ahead and just make a big clean sweep of it all. So if you want to know anything additionally about the games that we've already covered, go ahead and go back and watch those videos. And also, I don't want to just completely wipe away all the spin-off games. With those, the ones that I have talked about and I will talk about, they do have interesting battle systems of their own, especially Final Fantasy Tactics. Now, we haven't talked about Final Fantasy Tactics yet. We're going to be doing that in month 12, which is going to be our Ivalice month. But I don't want to just sweep those under the rug. Like I said, they are incredibly important in the franchise's history. But all that aside, let's go ahead and talk about the original big game. So with the original games, we have a pretty standard turn-based battle system. However, we actually do take for granted a lot of things that were very unique at the time at which these came out, especially the original Final Fantasy. Much of the console RPGs back then were played out in a first-person perspective, specifically showing the menus at the bottom and the enemies in front of you. You never actually saw your character fight. Final Fantasy changed all of this by introducing a side view to the battle system where you can see your character's attack, and it's pretty much been that way throughout most of the games, if not changed, just a little bit in Final Fantasy 13 and 15 and the MMOs. Though in Final Fantasy 1, it was super basic. Later on, we began to see some of the strategic and artistic things that just simply aren't possible with a standard first-person RPG battle system. So as we see, as the series marches on, those things such as rows were introduced, which allowed for some strategic placement of, let's say, fighters and magic users. Similarly, this allowed for us to see some really cool things artistically, such as the changing of armor and weapons that were reflected in the battles. So not only would you see these awesome weapons with cool abilities and stats, you also actually physically see how they look in battle. It's really cool that they did that. So with that being said, that's just a brief overview of the entire franchise. Let's go ahead and get into some of the games and touch on their major contributions in the way that the battles are fought. In general, Final Fantasy uses a turn-based battle system where the speed of your characters are compared to the speed of the enemies, and then you select an action whenever your turn comes up, and most of us know this. Let's take a look at the differences, though, that the games actually provide compared to one another. In Final Fantasy 1, the biggest difference here is the way that magic is handled compared to basically every other game in the franchise. And while this is true in most of the games that magic is different, in Final Fantasy 1, it's more pronounced with the usage of the magic. Specifically, it's on a daily cooldown. Now, what does this mean? Well, this actually comes directly from Vancine casting from Dungeons & Dragons, a tabletop game. We are a tabletop role-playing game channel here on YouTube. And it also comes from Jack Vance's novels. And in later versions of the game, though, this was actually scrapped and it was changed to a more traditional MP system that people sort of associate more so with a Final Fantasy game or just a general video game RPG. So let's go ahead and move on. In Final Fantasy II, levels no longer existed. That was just a majorly huge thing. And you see this a lot of the time when games appear on, let's say, Nintendo, and then their sequel comes up and just radically different things are tried out. And as we look back to it today, it does seem just completely out of the ordinary, but you have to remember that this is the sequel. They wanted to do something different. And in Final Fantasy II, like I said, levels are completely gone. Instead, they opted for a more kind of skill-based approach. Whenever you used a particular attack, or let's say you got hit, or you cast a spell, or whatever the particular thing may be, you actually get better at that. Whenever you attack, you get better with your attack weapon and you do more damage. Whenever you use magic, you level that up and you get more MP, or you get higher damage with the magic. And whenever you take hits, you get more HP, etc. And this is actually similar to, let's say, the Elder Scrolls series. And how Final Fantasy uses it, in theory, it's actually pretty amazing. It's incredibly boundary pushing, but it really doesn't play out well in execution as it's pretty abusable. But, I still like what they tried to accomplish accomplished with it, and it does really deserve merit for that, and it's not that bad. In Final Fantasy III, the biggest aspect here is the introduction of the job system itself. Whereas in Final Fantasy I, yes, you could pick the jobs at the beginning of the game. Here, in Final Fantasy III, the aspect is greatly improved upon, allowing you to mix and match a myriad of different classes. We're actually going to see this pop up again in a much more expanded form during Final Fantasy V, where you can actually learn abilities of classes, switch to other classes, and then use the abilities that you learned for those. It's incredibly customizable, and honestly, it's the best thing probably about Final Fantasy V. Everyone loves the class system of Final Fantasy V. Let's hop back a little bit in Final Fantasy IV. We go to a very basic system with jobs and magic, and while it does take a step back in that aspect on customizability, we have one of the most important introductions into the franchise of the entirety of Final Fantasy, and that is the ATB system, the Active Time Battle System. What this does is assigns a time gauge to each character that fills up during battle, and once that happens, you get to issue a command, an attack or magic or whatever. No longer is this a static turn-based kind of game. It requires more participation and interaction from the player. However, that being said, you could set this to a wait type of style, which would essentially create a standard turn-based system that we're pretty much all used to at this point. It was recommended because it would give you an easier experience for the game. And the reason ATB was included in and of itself is quite interesting. Now, this is something that actually has repercussions to today itself. Back in the early 90s, the developers knew that Final Fantasy would eventually take on a real-time aspects to battle. And they actually talked about the way that the turn-based systems were implemented in the fact that they were simply a limitation of the hardware and they didn't really allow their true vision to come out. And that's incredibly interesting to me, seeing as the most recent game out is Final Fantasy 15. And that game has basically fulfilled the prophecy of the early 90s whenever they said that Final Fantasy was going to go to real-time combat. But anyway, let's move on from there. I already talked about Final Fantasy V. So here, moving on to 6, we start getting into battle systems, setting really hardcore in the ATB way. We move now towards the way that magic and abilities are learned, more so than rather tinkering really with the battle system itself. And it'll be this way for the next few games. In Final Fantasy VI, magic is learned from this Magicite, which is basically a summon, they also call them espers, where you attune yourself to these Magicite crystals and you learn particular types of magic. Let's say if you had Ifrit, you would learn fire magic, or Siren, you would learn cure magic, etc. And that's pretty much it. Every character themselves actually did have a special ability that they could do, which was completely different at the time with the input commands and how that would work, which was really cool. But let's go ahead and move on. In Final Fantasy VII, we have the well-known Materia system, which houses magical spells. They are the version of this game's crystals. In the Materia themselves, like I said, housed magical spells. They had abilities or ways to augment those spells or abilities. Weapons and armor have these slots in which you equip materia in, thus allowing you to use those abilities and magic as you see fit. However, your stat changes occur as well. Usually equipping a magical materia lowers your physical attributes while raising your magical power and MP, which is obviously used to cast that magic. And it really allows a huge customization that grants many different ways to approach the game. If you wanted to go for a more physical route, don't use materia. If you wanted to go super magical, you could. And this kind of builds off of the previous Final Fantasy VI. Next, though, is the real big reason that this video exists in this month, and that is Final Fantasy VIII's battle system. Really, this is one of the most experimental battle systems ever, like in any particular game. And it relies heavily on summoning, which you could make an argument that in respect, it's similar to, let's say, Final Fantasy VI. 6 had a ton of summons, but 8 is like the summoning game. However, it's really what those summons do and how they're related to magic that really just completely blows the door open on this game's battle system. First, magic is handled in a completely different way in this game, as it uses this draw system to stock up on magic. This is the first time since Final Fantasy I that the traditional MP system has just been completely overhauled. Magic is gained from drawing at special magical points on the map and fighting enemies that have those particular spells. So you draw them and you actually store them up and get them. Anyway, after you stock up on these magical spells, you can attach, or what they call junction, these summons known as guardian forces to your character, and from that you can junction magic to particular stats to increase them. For example, let's say you have here that you can junction to your hit points, and it'll boost that HP quite a bit. Each spell will boost different things considering if it's better or worse. You can imagine like haste, if you junction it to your speed, you would go faster, etc. What this means though is that whenever you use spells, the stat that it's junctioned to actually decreases. It's a really strange interplay, and that's not good or bad, it's just completely strange and completely different than any other game that you're probably going to see. Also in Final Fantasy VIII, I do want to mention that there is enemy scaling, and that's implemented in a really strange way, which can actually make the game much harder if you level up much more. A lot of people will do low-level runs with the particular junctioning system, and it can just make the game completely abusable, and you can blow through the game. But anyway, let's go ahead and move on. So, alright, Final Fantasy IX. 9 is a pretty easy one here. It goes back to its roots. There's not a lot to say about it. It's similar to Final Fantasy VI in the way that you learn spells and abilities. However, instead of using Magicite, it's just completely equipment based. You get different equipment, you equip that equipment, and you will learn the different magics and spells and abilities and everything from those equipment. And then after you get enough points, you can take off and remove the equipment, but still retain that ability or magic or whatever you had learned. It's easy enough system, especially coming off of the complicated Final Fantasy VIII. So Final Fantasy X now actually ditches the ATB, the active time battle, for the first time since Final Fantasy IV, and it goes back to a pure turn-based system. However, you can see the order that people are going to go ahead of you, 7 or 8 turns ahead, and you can actually plan out your strategy accordingly. Also, for the first time, and this is just mind-blowing, you can switch your characters out mid-battle, which was always just a ton of fun. Final Fantasy X dispensed with a regular leveling in favor of a sphere system, so there's not any traditional levels that you would expect, but you go along this maze of nodes, and each one was kind of similarly flavored to a particular job or class. Like, you would find all the cures in one spot, or all the elemental magics in one spot, like a white mage or black mage. Anyway, you would learn those and all the spells and abilities and everything as you go throughout the game. So heading on to Final Fantasy XI, it was the first MMO of the series. Final Fantasy XI returned to a traditional job system, probably more closely resembling Final Fantasy V with a job and sub-job system. Everything here is tied to your level. However, you did have different skills to level up whenever you attacked with different weapons. That was something that was a little bit interesting. But aside from that, really the only thing more that was a little bit different is that you could go and attack enemies really quickly as a group, and then you could chain those and get a lot of XP gain. We'll see this chaining ability kind of thing return in Final Fantasy XII. It's a simple system, but it's a classic system. And here, like I said, Final Fantasy XII, this is a radical departure from the series, which has fans completely divided on it. Final Fantasy XII allows the control of only one character at any particular time, though you can switch at any point. This system was called the Gambit system and used the ATB. Actually, they had renamed it the Active Dimension Battle, ADB system, but whatever, ATB system, it's pretty much what it is. The different thing here is that there are no battle transitions to a battle screen. Instead, here, everything is fought on the exploration map, and in this case, you assign abilities and when to use those abilities based on different conditional parameters. It's really similar to conditional operators in a programming language, using simple if-then statements. So for example, let's say you've set HP is less than 50% and then use a potion. Whenever your HP dropped below half, you would use a potion, and it would keep executing that until your HP was above half, and then it would go to the next statement. And you could set up a ton of these that would execute from top to bottom and basically have the game do that for you. And I personally love the system, but a lot of people think that it's just an autopilot, and once you get the particular set of gambits, you can blow through the game. And I mean, yeah, you can, that's exactly right, but it's still really cool, and I think it's just good on an educational aspect, which is teaching kids programming language whether they know it or not. This brings us up to Final Fantasy XIII, and despite the flack that game gets, it generally has a highly rated battle system. At least the people that don't like the game still usually say that the battle system's, pretty good. It is called the Command Synergy Battle. It's basically an ATB system with modified aspects. Here, you actually can only control one person. However, the idea that so many people don't get is that it is not about fine manipulation of the battle, but overall strategy. This is a macro management rather than a micromanagement. You assign sets of jobs or classes, and they are completely different than any Final Fantasy jobs or classes so far, but anyway, you set those, and throughout the battle, you can change them on a whim. So you can switch to a more offensive set of classes, or defensive, or healing, or whatever you want. It just depends on the situation that you're in the battle. And a lot of people complain about this, saying it's just hit X to win, because whenever you attack with the character that you have control of, you can hit and it will do the best thing that it thinks that you need to do, which is fine. In that aspect, you could say it's hit X to win, but that is not the point of the game. Here it's the switching to allow you an overall high-level strategy of the game. If you just hit X to win, you're going to lose the game pretty quickly. So it's not micromanaging individual attacks here, it's the overall strategy. Also, Final Fantasy XIII uses a system to level up similar to the sphere grid of Final Fantasy X, and in 13 they call it the Crystarium, which, where have I heard that name before? Oh well. Anyway, let's move on. Final Fantasy XIV. We have the second and hopefully last MMO of the series. Final Fantasy XIV is a fantastic game, but there shouldn't be two MMOs in this series, honestly. But Final Fantasy XIV is an evolution of the Final Fantasy XI system, at least in the current iteration of the game. Final Fantasy XIV has an incredibly interesting history, but I'm talking about the game as it is now. It uses a sub-job system in general, and it also introduces some of the newer jobs to the franchise, some completely new ones, like the Astrologian, which is pretty fun. But Final Fantasy XIV, honestly, is your run-of-the-mill theme park MMO with levels and abilities gained at those levels. The game can get incredibly complex, though, at super high-level play, with different rotations of ability cooldowns. But for the majority of the casual players, it's easy enough to pick up and play. It's not a ton to learn, except for the fact that if you are very high level, you do have a ton of abilities. And this brings us up to Final Fantasy XV, the widest departure from the franchise as a whole. Final Fantasy XV is the first game to use a completely 100% real-time battle system. The main game allows you control of one character, and that is Noctis, the main character, and his ability to wield and switch weapons at will. And he can throw them and teleport around the battlefield, striking from afar. It's a really, really visceral and cool combat system. I love it. And it allows for some pretty insane visual spectacle, as well as chaining abilities with other party members that you can assign. Of course, you can equip all of your party members with different weapons. It's a really cool system. Magic in Final Fantasy XV is a little bit more interesting in that it is incredibly powerful, and it affects the environment around you because the game is not fought in any particular battle window. It's just all on the exploration map, like Final Fantasy XII in that respect. But the way that magic works here is that it does not discern friend or foe, so you need to watch out when, where, and how you use it. The magic specifically, I'm talking about the Elemancy part, which is the general magic that you would think of in a Final Fantasy game. It's sort of like Final Fantasy VIII in that you draw from specific magical nodes on the map. There are only 3 types though. We have lightning, fire, and ice, but you can mix and match and put items with them like elixirs or phoenix downs or potions or whatever, and you can create a ton of different spells, but really it is just based off of the 3 major elements. To be fair though, I find magic more trouble than it's worth. I just normally stick to my regular attacking combat. That being said, I do generally enjoy Final Fantasy XV's battle system, but many don't because it admittedly strays quite far from the tried and true traditional turn-based battle systems of the franchise. But let's not forget that the developers knew that the franchise would end up at this point way back in the early 90s. This is not a new thing at all. Everyone, if they were in the know, saw this coming. This is simply the next step on their ATB introduction. Love it or hate it, it's here to stay for a while, as Final Fantasy XV seems to be a game that is going to be iterated on at least for the foreseeable future. So like it, hate it, it's here to stay at least for quite a while. And with that, we'll draw this episode to a close. And this is one of the more involved episodes, but I think it's a good idea to step back and take a look at the franchise as a whole and how it's evolved during its incredibly massive 30 years of life. And next time we're going to be getting into one of the most divisive games of this long and storied franchise, of course, the main game of the month, Final Fantasy VIII. So until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.